All right, welcome. Today we are going behind the digital equivalent of yellow crime scene tape. We're going to dive into what happens after a cyber attack, and we'll look at the two sides of that coin. You've got the proactive shields of cybersecurity, and then you've got the reactive investigation of digital forensics. Let's get right into it.
So just imagine this for a second. Your company's entire network has been breached. The digital alarms are screaming, data might be leaking out, it's chaos. The bad guys are officially inside the building, so what's the move? What happens now? Who do you even call to figure out how they got in, what they managed to grab, and most importantly, how to make sure it never, ever happens again?
Okay, so this is where we meet our two main characters in this story. First, think of cybersecurity as the guards on the wall. Their whole job, their entire purpose, is prevention. They're building the digital fortress, right? They're setting up the locks, the alarms, the high walls, all to keep attackers out. But when that fortress is breached, that's when you call in the digital forensics team. These are the detectives. They show up to a crime scene that's already happened, and their job is to piece it all together and answer those huge questions. Who did this? What exactly did they do? And how in the world did they pull it off?
Now, to solve any crime, a detective needs clues. But in this world, we're not talking about physical footprints or fiber samples. Nope, they're on the hunt for digital fingerprints. And the key term you gotta know here is indicator of compromise, or IOC for short. The best way to think about these is as the breadcrumbs an attacker leaves behind, whether they mean to or not. An IOC is really any piece of data that screams, hey, something bad happened here. It's the digital version of a spent shell casing or a muddy footprint at a crime scene. So what do these digital fingerprints actually look like? Well, an IOC could be a malicious file, and you'd identify it by its unique signature, which we call a hash. And get this, a hash is so unique that changing just a single period in a giant document creates a totally different hash. Wild, right? An IOC could also be the IP address the attacker connected from, a shady website they used, some tiny change to a computer's core settings, or even just a bizarre pattern of data suddenly trying to leave the network. Every single one of those is a valuable clue. And you know, just like in the real world, the type of crime really dictates the kind of evidence you find. A ransomware attack, for instance, is going to leave behind very different IOCs, like a bunch of encrypted files, than, say, a phishing attempt, which might leave behind the attacker's malicious email addresses. The digital detective needs to know what kind of crime they're dealing with so they know what kind of clues to even start looking for. So, once our detectives have a pretty good idea of what they're looking for, they can't just dive in and start clicking around on the compromised computer. Oh no. There is a formal process, a strict methodology to make sure every single piece of evidence is preserved perfectly.
Basically, every professional digital investigation is going to follow this four-phase roadmap. First up is acquisition, which is all about carefully securing that digital crime scene. Second is recovery, and that's where you're digging for evidence the attacker tried to hide. Third, you've got analysis, where you start connecting all the dots to build a real story. And finally, there's presentation, which is when all the findings are formally written up and reported.
Let's really focus on that first phase for a second, because it is absolutely fundamentally critical. If you mess this part up, the whole case can fall apart. The goal is exactly the same as a physical crime scene. Get as much evidence as you possibly can without changing a single thing. One wrong move, one file that gets accidentally modified, and the entire investigation could be compromised.
So how do they do it? Well, there are some golden rules. First and foremost, you protect the original device. You never work on the original evidence, ever. Second, you have to grab the most volatile data first. We're talking about things currently running in the computer's active memory, stuff that will vanish into thin air the second you turn it off. Third, you make a perfect bit-for-bit copy of the hard drive, and that copy is what you do your investigation on. And finally, you document every single step. This is how you maintain the chain of custody, a legal record that proves the evidence hasn't been touched or tampered with from the moment it was collected.
All right, now we get to move into the recovery phase. And this is where the real detective work starts. Because attackers, they're experts at covering their tracks. Our investigators have to find clues that the criminals were absolutely certain they had destroyed forever.
And here's one of the biggest secrets in computing, something most people have no idea about. Hitting the delete key doesn't actually delete anything. Really, when you delete a file, the system usually just removes the pointer to that file. It's kind of like tearing a page out of a book's table of contents. The story itself, it's still there on the pages, just waiting until some new data gets written on top of it. And you better believe investigators know exactly how to find those so-called deleted chapters.
Attackers also use other really clever hiding spots. Take something called slack space. When a computer saves a file, it sets aside a block of space for it. If the file doesn't fill up the whole block, that leftover bit is empty. Well, it's the perfect little digital nook or cranny to hide fragments of malicious code or stolen data, and forensic tools are built specifically to scan these hidden spots.
And then you get into some really advanced, almost spy movie level stuff. Steganography. This is the art of hiding data inside of other data. An attacker could literally embed a stolen password list inside the pixels of a totally innocent-looking picture of a cat. To you and me, it's just a cat photo, but to a forensic analyst, it could be the smoking gun they've been looking for.
Of course, the biggest challenge of all is encryption. Finding encrypted data is like finding a locked safe at the crime scene. Sometimes, breaking that encryption is pretty much impossible. So, instead of trying to blow open the safe, investigators have to change tactics. They have to start hunting for the key, which might be hidden somewhere else on the system entirely.
Okay, so we've gathered all this evidence. We've got deleted files, hidden fragments, network logs, the whole shebang. Now it's time for the analysis phase. This is where the investigator takes all of these separate, scattered clues and starts to weave them into a single, coherent story of what happened.
The main goal of analysis is what we call event reconstruction. You know how in detective movies they always have that giant corkboard? It's covered in photos and little notes, and it's all connected by pieces of string? Well, a forensic analyst is doing the exact same thing, just with digital evidence, putting every single event in the correct order to reveal the full story of the attack from beginning to end.
And building that precise timeline is absolutely crucial. To do it, investigators have to pull from a bunch of different data sources. They'll pore over system logs, which are basically the computer's diary of every single thing it did. They'll examine file timestamps to figure out the exact second a malicious file was created or accessed, and they'll sift through mounds of firewall data to trace the attacker's path into, and more importantly, out of the network.
So, after all of this incredibly detailed work, securing the scene, recovering hidden data, building a timeline, what's the big payoff? Why does this whole process matter so much in our digital world? Well, it really all comes down to three huge outcomes. First, you get evidence. The IOCs you find become a blueprint of the attack, which not only shows you what happened, but helps you build way better defenses for the future. Second, you get a timeline. This helps you figure out the full blast radius of the attack, what data was stolen, which systems were compromised. And third, you get attribution. Now, this is the hardest part, but sometimes the clues can lead investigators right to the keyboard of the person or group responsible.
So, what's the big takeaway here? You know, while cybersecurity is all about building bigger and stronger walls, digital forensics reminds us that understanding how the crime happened is just as important as trying to prevent it. Because in the world we live in now, the most important clues, they're no longer found under a microscope. They're found hidden in the ones and zeros of a